Hello and welcome to episode 20 of Madget and the Other Guy. And Kevin and I are sitting outside my home here on the banks of Lake Wylie in Charlotte, North Carolina on a cold but very pretty sunny day.
It's a very beautiful day. Chilly, but beautifully and sunny.
Yeah, and quite quiet as well. Not an awful lot happening out on the lake today. As ever, I never know what we're going to be talking about. I don't know why this tradition ever started, but here we are at episode 20 and we're still doing it. So Kevin, you do know what we're going to be talking about, so start us off.
Well, this is something I think many people are starting to look forward to once again when we can get to a better position is trips, planning trips and trips that we've taken and reflecting upon them and such like that.
Okay. Yes, and I used to travel an awful lot, especially with Formula One, but even when working in TV with Speed Vision and later with Fox and then with NBC, and for a while I was living on the other side of the Atlantic in France, restoring a home in France, as we've talked about before. I used to do an awful lot of flying, and it seemed very odd in a way to fly from France over to the United States to cover the French Grand Prix, and then Sunday night after the race turn around and head back home to France. But that was the quirky business of TV and motor racing combined. But despite all the years and the endless flights that I've taken, I've got to tell you, Kevin, I actually do not enjoy flying at all.
You've had your fill.
Yes, well, yes, absolutely, I've had my fill. And as a younger guy, it never really used to faze me. I mean, if my team manager at Benetton said, "Hey, Steve, we need to do a test in Portugal, jump on the flight, we're off this afternoon," it would go without a second thought. Or the idea of travelling coach, economy as would say in Europe, down to Australia, and it was over a 20-hour flight with several stops en route, we would all just do it without thinking about it, just part of the job. But as the years have gone on, and I'm now 58, I have always suffered with a little bit of claustrophobia. It's not bad. I'm not afraid of flying. I'm not afraid of heights, but I don't enjoy being in confined spaces. I never have. And as the years go on, that slight fear, that slight claustrophobic feeling has only increased. Is that something you've ever suffered from, or not at all?
Not really. I think it's funny, the only time I could relate to exactly that thing is we were setting up, in college, setting up this bed that was going to be, and I had to crawl up way up under it to get a bolt in there. And I was like, I'm almost in a coffin in this thing, the way I am. Somebody's going to have to pull me out by the legs. But I don't think I have an innate fear of that. But
yeah, it's been with me for a long while, and it only gets. But again, it's I'm not terribly affected by it, but I don't enjoy it. But we often talk about movies and TV. And there is a scene with Uma Thurman being buried alive in Kill Bill 2, I think, isn't it? Right?
Definitely one or two. One of the two,
Kill
absolutely.
Bill 2. And whenever I'm kind of a fan of Tarantino's movies. I like the way he puts I like the way Tarantino directs, and I love the dialogue. I'm not overly keen on the endless, blood splashes across the screen, but I do like the Tarantino dialogue. And whenever I watch Kill Bill 2 and I see Uma Thurman being buried alive in that scene, it really does upset me. Yeah. And at one time, I did look into taking different forms of transport other than flying across the Atlantic from France over to the States before I moved over to the States full time, just to get away from flying. And I did take the Queen Mary 2, which had fairly recently been commissioned by Cunard as a passenger liner. And I wanted to try and take it as, a form of passage rather than a pleasure cruise. I wanted to see if I could make it work, just to get me away from the aircraft. But it was kind of an unusual trip. But the big problem in terms of it, as a commute, it was a 5-day trip. Well, it doesn't really work. It's 5 days on a very nice ocean liner, or just sticking with it for 8 hours in a 747 or whatever it would be, an Airbus or something, and I couldn't really make it work. But it was quite an odd trip, and I'm pleased I took that trip. But I have to say, my overriding memory of those 5 days of crossing the Atlantic on the Queen Mary 2 was just how vast and how incredibly lonely it is out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It is just endless square miles of grey rolling ocean and
Oh, yeah.
nothing else.
Yeah, I've never done a transocean trip,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Yes, and I can remember there was one part of the crossing. I mean, we were pretty much as close to being in the middle as you can get, I guess. And the only other vessel we saw was like a cargo ship or an oil tanker or something. It was a good distance away from our ship, but it was following on the same course as we were. I'm going to guess it was probably 2, maybe 3 miles away from us. But for a couple of days, it kind of stuck with us all the way. And I thought, I wonder whether that's a deliberate, I didn't know, and I never asked anybody on board, but I wonder whether that was a deliberate act on behalf of both captains, saying, this is probably a good idea,
Yeah.
that, let's just, why would we not do
Strengthen
this?
numbers if something were to happen
Yeah,
to one.
if
it
we're in
certainly can't
trouble,
hurt.
you're there, and
Yeah.
vice versa, yeah.
I'd like to know a little bit of a security blanket was on one side of the ship or the other.
Yes, it was an unusual trip, and we did cross over the exact point in the on the Atlantic or over the Atlantic where the Titanic sank. And for a couple of days, we knew that was coming up. So it's marked on the map where we were
Okay.
going, But yes, boy, oh boy, it is. I mean, it is a watery desert out there. There's just nothing there.
What time of year did you cross?
It must have been about March or April. Yes, and there was no sunny days, I remember that. It was overcast and grey all the way.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But a memorable trip nonetheless. Oh, talking of memorable trips then, have you taken any one particular trip you think, oh, well, that was a quirky experience?
One thing I will interject as we're talking about water, you may hear there's a couple of the geese out here flopping and flipping around. They're trying to right themselves after going down for a fish. So if you hear that, that's what they're doing out here. I don't know how successful they are in their venture, but
Amazes me how they manage to keep swimming in these cold temperatures.
they got
Right.
a better level of body fat than I do, thankfully. But
Yeah.
well, I've been, to Europe. I think I mentioned this in a prior one, maybe that I did go to Europe the one time.
Yes.
To Austria.
Yes.
So that was my trip across the Atlantic anyway. Of course, that was in a flight. But talking about, traveling for business, we'll go back to that, is prior to traveling for business, I'd really only flown once before. I didn't fly until college. And what happened there was I was at my first year at Tennessee, and my parents still lived in Florida. So I was going to go back for spring break. So it took till, my freshman, or actually the latter part of my freshman year in college before I ever flew on a plane at all, except one small recreational trip up in a Cessna and back down. But from that point, then I started working for Goodies Family Clothing, a clothing retailer, and their offices were in Knoxville. And actually, I used to commute to Charlotte, well, not commute, but travel on business to Charlotte, where we are, of course, now.
Right.
And I mean, if you go way back and connecting to who I know, it's probably a lot of the reason I ended up here. But it brought me over here about every 2 to 3 weeks on average to do some business. And I still remember the very first time I came over, it's just these little planes because you're just going across the mountains essentially to get here. And the first time I flew was a little 19-passenger plane, I guess a prop jet of some sort. And I remember we went through turbulence, and the lady next to me clamped onto my hand like an iron claw.
Yes.
And here I am, pretty young, and it's just, your world is just like, hey, it is what it is, and my time's up. I mean, I was thinking it was like a roller coaster ride. Woohoo! Up and down.
You were loving it.
I thought it was, kind of wild. And it's like, hey, this is different. But boy, she was white-knuckled. But we, of course, landed fine and all that. But that really started my kind of regular commute, whereas your commute was quite longer. And, from across the Atlantic from one country to another, I was jumping across the mountains every few weeks, which was actually kind of fun. Again, I was single, and I could go on a moment's notice and stay as long as I needed to. And then, whatever the schedule brought about, I was happy to do it. And the planes got that was the only time as that 19 passengers. They got a little bit bigger. And gosh, there's just so many times that, it'd be like on the fly, just, hey, we need you over there. All right, I'll just run home and throw stuff in a duffel bag, and I'll be at the airport within a couple of hours and be ready to go. Many times I'd be the last flight back from Charlotte to Knoxville, and it may be myself and like 2 other passengers,
I'd never bothered. You see, you've never been bothered by flying. I mean, that story that you just shared with us there of the passenger next to you clamping onto your arm because of the turbulence. See, I think we're all bothered by different things, and it's possibly not something it's not a rational fear. It could be a fear of anything, whether it's flying or turbulence or small spaces, or whether it's spiders or bees or whatever it is. There is something that bothers us all, but that's certainly it for me. And I tell you, actually, thinking about flying, the one thing that gets to me more than anything now on aircraft, it's that moment when the plane lands and taxis to the gate, and everybody stands up to get out.
Yeah.
And there's that realization, unless you're fortunate enough to be right at the front of the plane, there's that realization that you can't move. I'm trapped in this position. I can't go anywhere. That's what does it for me. That's what I really don't like about it. It's that feeling of, I guess to an extent, it's that feeling of being out of control, but it's not really desire for control. It's just a desire to have the freedom to get off when I want to get off.
Yeah.
And of course you can't. You can't do that.
Yeah, it even helps being in an aisle. At least you can, you stand up and you start gathering your belongings. I always like trying, I grab the bag for the person behind me and stuff like that. Cause,
Yes.
and again, you're not going to be getting out until the rest of the flow ahead of you goes. So you might as well just be patient.
It's only something. I mean, it's definitely increased this unwillingness to fly. It's definitely increased with age because, again, when I was, very fortunate to be traveling the world with Benetton, and it was a life that I absolutely loved and adored. Could be sitting at the window seat on the back row of a 747 on the way to Australia, and it wouldn't bother me at all.
Yeah.
I had no problem with it. It's only in the last 20 years where it started sort of creep up on me that I don't like flying. But I have only taken a tiny plane like you describe. I did that once, and I was flying, well, actually twice because I had to come back. I was flying to Bimini, and I think it's from Fort Lauderdale, and it was on one of my little Hemingway getaways. I'd been reading Islands in the Stream, and much of that book is set on the island of Bimini, and I know Hemingway had spent some time there, and I had some time to kill in between two races when I was staying out in the States. I thought, oh, Bimini, let's go and explore. That'd be fun, and it was a great fun experience. But the idea of being in that little plane it was 30 minutes tops probably before we landed in Bimini. It's not something I'd want to repeat really. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just, like I say, that early part of the career, I was doing those little short hops, all the time.
Yeah.
I still remember one time too. We were coming into Charlotte, and it was a fairly small plane. It was bigger than that 19 passenger, but probably like the next size up. And as we're approaching, I just heard the landing gear just grind. It was like, and I was like, well, that can't be good. But we landed just fine, and they were kind of slow at getting some stuff done. And as we got off, what had happened is on the underbelly, some of the hydraulic lines had ruptured and spewed hydraulic fluid all over the luggage, and
No
also
kidding.
it caused the grinding sound.
Wow.
They still worked and landed us fine, but. So they're handing us this coated luggage, and they're like, "Go see the people inside." So we go in there, and
Is
we're
that
like,
right?
"Yeah." And so I had this bag, a great, cool little duffel bag I'd had since high school. I really liked it, and I just started pulling out clothes that were just caked in this fluid. And at first they were like, "Going, well, we'll give you this bag as a replacement, some little cheap nylon thing." And I'm like, "Nope." And I just started pulling out clothes and giving them prices because I was like, $20, $30, $20. $40, and they just wrote me a check. And what little I could survive with, they gave me a trash bag. So I showed up at the job, and I said, "Do you like my luggage?" Which was, via Glad.
Yeah, well, I've never heard of that before. Hydraulic lines splitting and spraying over.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know how that happened or how it looked
Yeah.
under there, but it just spewed fluid all over all our luggage.
I haven't had an experience like that. I mean, certainly I've been on many flights where the luggage has never arrived. Don't know where that luggage went, but it never joined me.
There's always those tales. I'm not sure if that ever happened to me.
I do remember coming into talking about Australia. I remember we were coming in to land once. I think it was either Adelaide or Melbourne, and I was on a flight. I think it was a flight that was in Australia from an Australian destination to another Australian destination, so it wasn't an international flight. But I remember being on a flight in Australia and coming into land, and we got lower and lower and lower as we were approaching the runway, and we were very low to the ground when all of a sudden the pilot just gave it full power, and I remember it because it was one of those experiences. I thought, wow, you never realise quite how much power an aircraft has got until the pilot really calls upon it. And we shot back up into the sky. And, it was a very dramatic moment, roaring up into the sky again. And we banked steeply over to the right and corrected ourselves and went into a circular path around the airport. And then eventually the pilot came on the radio onto the tannoy and he said, "Oh, I'm very sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. We had to abort that landing because somebody was already using the runway." So, okay, okay, yeah.
I had the same thing happen.
Did you?
Yep, coming into Charlotte, because I can tell you, again, we didn't touch and then take off. It was getting close and then high acceleration back up. And what it was the Charlotte Hornets basketball plane was on our runway.
No kidding. There you go.
Yeah, the team's plane.
Yeah.
So.
But I was aware, I mean, the thrust from those engines when the pilot calls upon that power was really quite remarkable. I remember that to this day. We used to travel, because, traveling with Formula One so often, and because the races were so regular on the schedule, a lot of the cabin crews would recognize us, and we would recognize them, and particularly on the, again, talking about Australia on the Qantas flights. And when we were coming back from Australia on Qantas, quite often back then, it's not really the case now at all, because all flights seem to be packed all the time. A lot of those long-haul Qantas flights were actually not that busy. And although we were, the vast majority of the team were traveling coach class, economy class, we would quite often have a row of seats all to ourselves in the back there, and cabin crew were really, really very decent to us, and they would bring us blankets and pillows, and they just go to sleep, take the whole row.
Lift the armrest up. And
exactly that. We'd have a bed there, and it was terrific. They used to take great care of us. But, well, sadly, for many reasons, those wonderful days of when air travel was considered fun, I think they've gone, haven't they?
Well, and two, I did all this jumping across the mountain from Knoxville to Charlotte back pre 9/11 too. So it was, I could show up 10 minutes before the flight and walk right on.
Yeah.
They weren't all the stringent, things they have to have now. So it was a lot more leisurely just to get on and off the plane and be there. I got to, and Knoxville Airport wasn't very big, so it was always just park the car, roll in, walk under the metal detector. If it didn't go off, things are good. And, I walked on to my gate and got on the plane.
No, yes, that's exactly right. I'd almost forgotten about that. But once again, another Australian story. Yes, I remember those airports. The Australians, very much like in the States, treat domestic air travel almost like in England. It'd be like catching the train or catching the coach, catching the bus. And you could walk into an airport and walk right up to the gate, and no one would say anything to you. There was no real security check, and you could wait there with friends and relatives at the gate until the flight was taking off.
I remember that as a kid, big time. Greeting family or sending them off. We'd go to the gate with them, and you'd go to a big window and watch the plane take off.
Yeah, of course, my great personal claim to fame with air travel formed the plot of The Chariot Makers, when I described being fortunate enough to be taking Concorde over the Atlantic from New York over to Paris.
Yeah, that's a great experience that not many can say they've done.
Yeah, and it's such a remarkable experience, because how often does that happen? And for Air France to just upgrade me onto the Concorde flight because my flight the previous night was cancelled. It was such a wonderful experience, because not long after that the service was taken off and Concorde's never flown again.
Yeah.
But I still have. I know you're a big collector of almost anything and everything. You love collecting things, and I still have the boarding pass from that flight.
Oh, absolutely.
Air France 001, I think, was the flight number, and the menu on board and the wine list on board, and I was so taken with that trip. I thought, just wonderful experience, everything about it. That when I was thinking about writing part 3 of my F1 trilogy, I was thinking that flight, I must include that flight in some way, because it was a great personal memory. And so I worked it into the plot of the book to tell that story of Formula One technology. But yes, I'm glad it's happened. I'm glad I had the experience of it. But all in all, if I can not take a flight these days, I'm perfectly happy to do that.
Well, back in that early part of my career when I was working at Goodies, the company had 3 planes because most of our stores were kind of in smaller towns. So they wouldn't be serviced by major airports anyway. So, and whatever reason, the company had 3. So I still remember one time we had an emergency where I worked in advertising, and we had to have some printing done, and the printing press that we were going to use, they had a fire at the building. And this was a very important job, so we sourced it out. We're going to have the Orlando Sentinel newspaper prints.
Okay.
The presses down there were going to do
Yeah.
it for us. And at that time, we were just happy to find anybody that could get it done. So instead of sending it to a normal spot, they needed us in Orlando. And I remember he just came to me, and I was involved with that process of that piece. And he said, "Okay, we're flying down to Orlando. We're going to take the company Lear." I was like, "All right, sounds good to me." So, and I'd never flown on anything like that.
Right.
And I remember when we got to the airport, it's very nice because it's your own private, hangar and everything like that through the smaller aviation place. You just go in the lobby and they take you out to the plane. And I do remember the pilot said, "Now what you want to do is you want to go in the back and you want to sit facing forward." And we said, "Okay." And we found out why, because when those Lears take off, it's almost like a straight up shot.
Yes.
Once it got off the tarmac, it just went straight up.
Very steep vertical climb.
Yeah. So we flew that all the way to Orlando, and it's probably what made me think about that is that the Concorde is the fuselage is much smaller,
Yes.
and same with the Lear. A Lear is a pretty diameter-wise, the fuselage is pretty small, so you
Yeah.
got to hunch over, to go to your seat and sit down, and then so that was the only time we flew that plane. But there was a couple other occasions where we had to fly with the company plane, and we also had a King Air, which was a prop jet.
Oh, okay.
And
all right.
but it was much more comfortable, but it was slower. So it took you longer,
Yeah.
but the comfort level on it was nicer because it had higher headroom and such like that. And we had the third, I think, was something called a Navajo. Again, smaller aviation people know exactly what I'm talking about. And I never even saw that one, so I never flew on it. But it was kind of nice to do the smaller planes. In fact, one time we had one of our vendors, as a kind of a thank you for our business for the year, he took some of us on a golf trip to Pinehurst here in North Carolina.
Yeah, very nice.
From Knoxville, and they said, "We'll pick you up in our plane." And it was a prop jet of some sort. And the pilot, I believe he was from Finland. His name was Juha. And we were flying and stuff. He's really, and it was just him up front, and he would let us come up, in the cockpit with him.
Yeah.
And at one point, I remember I could hear everybody in the back goes, "Is Kevin flying the plane?" Because all of a sudden the tail is, going all wonky and it's starting to shift left and right. Because I wasn't, but he let me know. We were perfectly safe up in the air for me to take the controls.
Oh, so Kevin was flying. the
Kevin
plane.
was flying.
Yeah, right.
But those things are so sensitive. I mean, if you're used to them, it's great. But
Yeah.
I mean, just the slightest movement of my foot sent it, banking this way and whatever. But so I can say I flew a plane for a few minutes anyway.
Yeah, that's
that was a great experience.
But you're absolutely right. Yeah, in years gone by, there'd be no problem. You could ask to go up to the flight deck, and the pilots were very pleased to see you.
Yeah, especially kids. They let the kids come out and see
Yeah.
what the cockpit looks like. Give them a pair of wings and such.
Yeah, but now you've reminded me, actually, talking about Concorde, when you say that the interior was relatively cramped. Yes, it was relatively cramped. I do remember that now. And the seating was all 2 by 2, 2 aisle, then 2, and all very comfy, but not actually very big in there. And the one thing that does stick in my memory is that the windows, or the portholes, or whatever you describe them, they were a little bigger than a paperback book. I mean, they were relatively small things. Flying used to be great fun, but I don't think it's great fun any longer, is it? Unfortunately.
Now, what used to be a thing of grandeur, especially in the early days, where people would dress to the nines and be like they were going on a major social event or something like that to fly. It was an age that we'll never see again.
I do think, if ever I won the lottery, I've always said I would open a cinema that would show old classic movies, and folks would not be allowed to talk or have cell phones on in the cinema. But if I won a really big number on the lottery, what I would love to do would be to build a replica of a big airship like a Zeppelin, and have that wonderful comfort in an air balloon and cross the Atlantic slowly in an air balloon. And I think that would be a fantastic way to travel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, talk about an era gone by. There you go.
Yes. Yeah. Terrible, terrible tragedy what happened to the Hindenburg and all of that. Of course it is. And I just wish that I mean, who knows? Who knows what's going to happen in the future? But if we could figure out a way to make air balloons profitable again, and have just wonderful, luxurious compartments within an airship and cruise across the Atlantic in an airship,
Yeah, and you have to look at it as I'm not in any hurry to get there because that's not what it's all about. It's all about the journey on a trip like
It's
that.
all absolutely, yeah. It's a bit like taking the Orient Express train. You're not in a rush to get to Istanbul, but you just want the experience of the luxury travel by train. Yeah, similar in a way, I think, to different in the States, I think, but over in Europe and most especially in England, we had such wonderful canal system for canal boats and barges to transport goods around, coal and whatever. And it wasn't a quick way of transporting goods, but I'm sure it was a relatively cheap way of transporting goods. And you know, the folks that looked after and ran the barges, I mean, they would do so for a lifetime when they would cruise up and down the length and breadth of England all time, you know, be on the road or on the canal permanently.
Yeah.
It sounds like a wonderful thing to do. And then I would say over the last 30 years, a lot of those old canal systems, they became redundant when roads opened up and everything went into trucks, and you know, trucking became such a big business and the canals fell into disrepair. But a lot of those old canal systems have been repaired and opened up by enthusiasts, and canal holidays, vacations are fairly popular, not just in England, but France as well, and Germany and all over, I guess. Anywhere that had a big canal system. But I think the idea of transporting freight by canal is another great idea. I think that's something we should look into. Yeah. Well, I think we've got to get used to this idea, not going off, well, we do go off track all the time when we talk, but we've got to get off this idea of we need everything tomorrow. You know, I know that's completely anti what Amazon is so keen to promote, but if we can work out a way that we don't need these goods tomorrow, but we can have them in a month from now, I think that would help us out enormously. We'll be able to just take time. We need to spend more time, not just rushing all the while.
Yeah. If there's certain things that have to be here tomorrow and need to be for certain reasons, that's great. But if you can get them to their, you know, this is section Z, and they don't have to be here. If they show up in a month, they show up in a month. Yeah. We're happy. As long as we can track it, we're good. We know where they are at some point.
Yes. Now, we started off this conversation by my describing a trip that I took on the Queen Mary tour over the Atlantic. And another option that I considered but I didn't take up was traveling by cargo ship, by freight ship across the Atlantic, which I understand is quite a pleasant way of doing things, and it takes much longer. So you could catch that freight ship, for example, in Lisbon in Portugal or Barcelona in Spain, and the ship very slowly goes round the bottom of Europe and across the Atlantic and has only something like room for, let's say, 10 or 14 passengers. Basically, you're bunking up with the crew. It's a very cost-effective way of travel, but I think that would be quite an experience to do that across the Atlantic.
I've never really thought about them doing it like that, but I guess, you know, if they're going and can make a little extra off something like that, and we're going, why not take some passengers along with us?
Why not fill those spaces up? Yeah.
When you did your trip, though, which port did you leave from, and which port did you arrive at?
Southampton, and we ended up in New York, and the boat, the ship docked at what is now used or was used for the Formula E race.
Okay.
On the opposite side of Manhattan, if you like.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Because I remember, curiously enough, a couple of years ago when we were in New York with Fox, calling the Formula E race, the double header from New York, where all the Formula E crews and media were having lunch. I sat there having lunch with the guys, and I'm looking around this big hall, and I'm thinking, wait a moment, I know this place. Where do I know? It's like from something in a dream, you know. Wait a moment, why do I know this place? And then it came back to me. It was the Customs Clearing Hall, where the boats used to dock. Now I don't think the ocean liners, they dock on I think on the other side of Manhattan, away from that. But yes, I do remember when the Queen Mary 2 arrived into New York. It was timed deliberately, and it was kind of a fun thing to do at the time, just as the sun was coming up. We're talking about it being a cloudy crossing, and it was actually for 99% of the trip. But the morning that we docked into New York, we arrived just at sunrise, so about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. And all the decks of the Queen Mary 2 were full of passengers wanting to see the arrival into New York. So it's kind of a very special moment, really. So I'm very pleased I took that trip.
Oh, yeah.
It was great fun.
It's a glimpse back in time.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was a great fun experience. But talking about trying to use the Queen Mary 2 as a commute, on that trip were different forms of entertainment, movies and shows and guest speakers, and it was all very entertaining. I do remember talking with the head of entertainment on the Queen Mary 2 about my desire to be able to use this as a commute. If I was just getting into conversation one night at the bar, and this chap said to me, well, you know, what do you do for a living, blah, blah, blah. So I described what I did, and when he said, well, we would always use, you know, a guest speaker of your caliber on this ship to entertain the passengers. And I said, well, that'd be something to look into. Because, yeah, that might help me. To cut a long story short, they did get back in touch with me about 6 months later, and they said, Steve, we'd like to offer you the job of a guest speaker on one of our cruises going from San Francisco down to it was down to Australia eventually. It was San Francisco down to Australia, stopping en route to 3 places. And I said, I'm sorry, I think you've got the wrong end of the stick here. I'm trying to get from Europe over to New York for work. You know, even if I went down to Australia, this wouldn't help me. So I couldn't take them up on that. Rather marvellous offer, because they would have...
Yeah, in retirement, that'd have been a wonderful offer.
That's right. No, they were offering me rather nice accommodation and, you know, on the travel on the boat down. But I said, it's not really going to help me. I'm trying to get to New York for business. So I couldn't make that work, unfortunately. Well, we better wrap this conversation up, and with that soon gone, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think we
Kinda fun.
covered some miles, both sea and land. sea and air.
Sea and land, yeah.
Over the land, anyway. Yeah.
Well, gentle listener, join us again when we will reconvene down on the banks of Lake Wylie in Charlotte. We'll have another conversation. We best say goodbye. Bye for now, Kevin.
Let's do it again.
All right, bye.